Music swelled through the grand ballroom of the Pierre, masking the lethal tension beneath diamond chandeliers. A lone sniper waited in the dark. One perfectly placed shot could topple New York's most feared empire. Yet survival didn't come from armed guards, but from the unlikeliest woman in the room. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a masterclass in gilded deception. Beneath the painted ceilings and cascading crystal chandeliers, New York's elite mingled with the city's most dangerous predators. It was the annual Children's Hope Charity Gala, a highly publicized event that served as a convenient, heavily guarded neutral ground for the East Coast syndicates. Eleanor Fitzgerald stood near a towering marble pillar, a flute of vintage Krug champagne resting loosely in her hand. She was the forensic accountant for the Mercer Syndicate, a woman whose brilliant mind untangled the labyrinthine offshore accounts and shell companies that kept the organization afloat. She was also a woman who commanded space. Eleanor was fat, and she carried her weight with an undeniable, unapologetic, regal grace. Her custom-made emerald silk gown draped flawlessly over her broad hips and thick thighs, the deep green fabric contrasting sharply with her pale skin and auburn hair. While the size 0 socialites flitted around the room like nervous birds, Eleanor stood, grounded, an immovable force of calm observation. She preferred the periphery. From here she could see everything. Her dark eyes tracked across the room, past the mayor, past the police commissioner, who was laughing a little too loudly, until they landed on her employer. Jonathan Mercer. Jonathan was the undisputed head of the syndicate. At 38, he possessed a cold, terrifying charisma that commanded absolute obedience. Tonight he wore a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo that accentuated his broad shoulders and lethal posture. He was standing near the towering French doors that opened out onto the terrace, deep in conversation with his head of security, Richard Davies. Something was wrong. Eleanor's mind was built to recognize patterns, and the pattern in front of her was completely off. Richard, a man who usually hovered over Jonathan like an anxious hawk, was subtly angling his body away from his boss. Richard's hand kept brushing the side of his jacket, tapping a frantic, erratic rhythm against his hip. More alarmingly, the perimeter guards near the terrace, usually a dense wall of muscle, had thinned out. There was a glaring 30-foot gap in the sightline between Jonathan and the dark glass of the doors. Eleanor took a sip of her champagne, her heart rate beginning to climb. Why would Richard leave the boss exposed to the terrace windows? She glanced at the heavy glass panes. The night outside was pitch black, a sharp contrast to the brilliant illumination of the ballroom. Then she saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of light on the glass. It was faint, swallowed instantly by the reflections of the chandeliers, but Eleanor had spent enough time poring over security footage and assassination reports to know exactly what it was. A laser sight. Someone was across the street, positioned high in the neighboring luxury apartments, aiming directly into the ballroom. She tracked the invisible trajectory from the window to the floor. The beam was moving. It swept past a silver champagne bucket, glinted off a socialite's diamond necklace, and began climbing the tailored pant leg of Jonathan Mercer. There was no time to scream. Shouting would cause a panic, and a sudden stampede would give the sniper the split second needed to pull the trigger before Jonathan could be secured. The guards were too far away. Richard was actively looking in the opposite direction. Eleanor slammed her champagne glass onto a passing waiter's tray and moved. For a woman of her size, she moved with shocking, terrifying speed. She didn't run. Running would draw the eye. Instead, she glided across the polished parquet floor with aggressive purpose, intercepting the space between Jonathan and the terrace doors. The orchestra shifted seamlessly into Shostakovich's Waltz No. 2, a sweeping, dramatic piece that swelled through the cavernous room. Jonathan turned his sharp, icy blue eyes, narrowing in irritation, as a figure abruptly entered his personal space. He opened his mouth to dismiss whoever was foolish enough to interrupt him, but the words died in his throat. Eleanor didn't ask for permission. She crashed into him, her soft, substantial curves pressing firmly against the rigid, muscular wall of his chest. Her right hand clamped onto his left shoulder with a grip like a steel vice, while her left hand caught his right, forcing his arm up into a ballroom frame. Jonathan's body instantly went rigid with lethal intent. His free hand twitched toward the concealed holster beneath his jacket. "Dance as my husband. There's a red dot on your forehead," she whispered, her voice a low, urgent hiss against his jaw. Jonathan froze. The sheer audacity of her action, combined with the chilling weight of her words, short-circuited his violent reflexes. He was a survivor, above all else. He didn't look toward the window. He didn't flinch. His eyes simply locked onto hers, dark and calculating. "Lead," he murmured back, his voice a dangerous rumble. Eleanor stepped backward, pulling him with her. "Keep your posture straight. Move into the turn. If we stop, you die." They swept onto the dance floor, a striking, unconventional pair, cutting through the sea of pastel dresses and dark suits. Eleanor's emerald skirt flared around her calves, a brilliant splash of color, as she forcefully steered the most dangerous man in New York away from the kill zone. 3 o'clock. Terrace doors, Eleanor murmured, her lips fixed in a polite, brilliant smile for the benefit of the onlookers. "Sniper. High elevation. The trajectory was aiming right for the space between your eyes." Jonathan smoothly took control of the frame, his hand resting firmly on the thick, warm curve of her waist. Despite the adrenaline spiking through his veins, he noted the solid, comforting pressure of her body against his. There was nothing fragile about her. She was an anchor in the sudden chaos. "Who?" Jonathan asked, his smile equally fake, his eyes scanning the crowd over her shoulder as they executed a sharp pivot. "I don't know who is holding the rifle," Eleanor replied, her breath slightly elevated from the exertion and the terror. "But I know who opened the door for them. It's Richard." Jonathan's grip on her waist tightened painfully. "Watch your accusations, Eleanor. Richard has been with the syndicate for 15 years. And for the last 6 months, he's been embezzling from the Cayman offshore accounts." Eleanor countered, flawlessly anticipating his pushback. They spun past a table of oblivious hedge fund managers. "I found the discrepancies 3 days ago. $4.2 million heavily obscured through dummy tech corporations. I was building the full dossier to present to you tomorrow. He must have realized the audit was closing in." Jonathan's jaw locked. The betrayal stung, a cold venom seeping into his chest. He looked past Eleanor's auburn hair and spotted Richard standing near the north exit. The security chief was staring at them, his face pale, his hand gripping a two-way radio. Richard hadn't expected Jonathan to suddenly take to the dance floor with the syndicate's accountant. The moving target had ruined the shot. He cleared the terrace guards. Jonathan stated the realization, solidifying into a quiet, deadly rage. "Yes," Eleanor said, keeping the waltz perfectly on tempo. "And right now he is trying to figure out how to reset the board. We are completely exposed out here, Jonathan. We need a blind spot." "The grand staircase," Jonathan murmured, leaning in close. The intoxicating scent of her perfume, something dark, woody, and expensive, filled his senses. "If we can make it behind the sweeping curve of the stairs, the marble will block the line of sight from the windows. From there, the service elevators." "We can't just sprint," Eleanor warned, her hand squeezing his shoulder. "If Richard realizes we know he'll order his loyalists in the room to open fire, there are at least 3 of his men stationed at the exits." "Then we dance." Jonathan said, his eyes dropping to meet hers. For the first time, he truly looked at her. Really looked at her. He knew Eleanor Fitzgerald as a genius, with numbers a quiet fixture in the boardroom, who drank black coffee and destroyed rival companies' financial structures with a few keystrokes. But here in his arms she was breathtaking. Her plush lips were parted, her chest heaving against his, her dark eyes entirely devoid of the fear that usually plagued those in his presence. She was magnificent, and she was currently the only thing keeping him breathing. The orchestra hit a sweeping crescendo. "Dip me," Eleanor commanded suddenly. "What? The laser, it's back." "Drop." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He hooked his arm firmly around her waist, bracing his legs, and dipped her deeply toward the floor just as they spun. A faint, terrible zip cut through the air, completely masked by the crash of the orchestra's cymbals. A crystal flute on a nearby table violently shattered into sparkling dust. A few guests nearby gasped, looking around in confusion at the broken glass, assuming a clumsy waiter had dropped it. Jonathan pulled Eleanor back up his heart, hammering against his ribs. It was too close. The sniper was getting impatient, taking shots on the move. "They missed!" Eleanor gasped, clutching his lapels, her emerald dress rustling loudly. "They won't miss twice," Jonathan growled. He abandoned the traditional waltz steps, forcing a much faster, aggressive tempo that dragged them rapidly toward the edge of the ballroom. "You hold on to me, Eleanor. Do you understand? Do not let go. I'm not planning on dying in a size 20 dress surrounded by hedge fund managers, Jonathan." She shot back, a spark of fierce, terrifying humor in her eyes. "Keep moving." They hit the edge of the dance floor. The massive, sweeping curve of the grand marble staircase loomed 10 feet away. Across the room, Richard Davies raised his two-way radio to his mouth, his eyes locked dead onto Jonathan. He was giving the order. The silent assassination had failed. It was time for the loud one. Jonathan saw 3 men in dark suits break away from the perimeter, their hands sliding beneath their jackets, walking briskly toward the staircase. "Eleanor," Jonathan said, his voice dropping all pretense of aristocratic charm. The street-bred, ruthless boss of the syndicate bled through. "When we get behind that marble, you take off your heels and you run for the kitchens. You don't stop for anyone." "I am not leaving you." She snapped her nails, digging into his suit jacket. "You don't know the access codes to the service corridors. I changed them yesterday during the security patch. You need me." Jonathan let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "You're a terrifying woman, Fitzgerald." "I'm an accountant mercer. I always balance the books." With a final violent spin, Jonathan practically threw them both behind the thick, impenetrable cover of the grand staircase. The heavy marble instantly cut them off from the ballroom's brilliant light and the sniper's line of sight. They crashed against the cool stone wall, breathing heavily in the sudden, claustrophobic shadow. Before Jonathan could draw his weapon, the deafening sound of a suppressed gunshot echoed through the narrow space. The plaster on the wall just inches from Eleanor's head exploded into a cloud of white dust. Richard's men had already cut off the escape route. Jonathan grabbed Eleanor by the waist, shoving her forcefully behind his broad frame, drawing his Glock 19 in a single fluid motion. The waltz was over. The war had just begun. The gunshot was a deafening crack in the tight marble-lined alcove, but Jonathan's reaction was instantaneous. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. Before the plaster dust could even settle on the shoulders of Eleanor's emerald silk gown, Jonathan pivoted his Glock 19, raising with terrifying mechanical precision. He fired twice. The suppressed thwip-thwip of his weapon was barely audible over the roaring orchestra still playing in the ballroom behind them, but the results were brutally effective. The first of Richard's men, a hulking enforcer named Gregory, whose private rap sheet Jonathan knew by heart, crumpled to the floor.